The Montana sky stretched endlessly, a dome of pale blue fading into streaks of rose and gold as the sun began its descent. The land beneath it was both harsh and breathtaking, rolling plains dotted with sagebrush and framed by distant, jagged mountains that seemed older than time itself. Here, survival was never promised. It was earned day by day through sweat, grit, and sheer stubbornness. The wind carried the scent of dust, horses, and wood smoke, a reminder that this was not a place for the faint of heart. It was the late 1800s, and the frontier was a crucible where lives were forged, tested, and too often broken. Down the narrow road leading into the ranching town of Ash Hollow, a woman trudged with weary steps, one hand clutched tightly around a fraying rope. At the other end of that rope stumbled a colt, its legs trembling, eyes half lidded with fever. Its once shiny coat had dulled, patches of hair sticking in matted clumps from neglect and travel. The animal looked as if one strong gust of wind might send it crumpling into the dirt, yet the woman urged it forward, whispering encouragements under her breath, as if sheer willpower could keep it alive. Her name was Clara May Benton, though no one here yet knew it. She wore a faded calico dress smeared with dust from weeks of travel, and her boots were cracked, barely holding together. Strands of chestnut hair escaped the knot at the back of her neck, plastered to her temples by sweat. She was young still, no more than 22, but grief and hardship had carved fine lines into her expression, as though sorrow had aged her beyond her years. In her satchel rested a single object more valuable than all her worldly possessions, a sealed letter addressed in her late father's hand. She had carried it unopened for nearly 2 months, unable to face the truth it might contain. Ash Hollow itself was not a forgiving place for strangers. As Clara led the colt into the main street, heads turned. Men leaned on hitching posts, pausing their idle talk. Women in long skirts peered from porch steps, their eyes full of curiosity laced with judgment. In a town where everyone knew everyone else, outsiders were often treated like interlopers, threats to the fragile balance of community life. Clara could feel the weight of their gazes pressing down on her as surely as the Montana sun. Her throat tightened, but she kept her chin lifted. She had endured whispers before, back in Kansas, after her father's passing and her mother's illness. When she sold the last of their belongings and left with nothing but the colt and the letter, neighbors had called her reckless, cursed even. But she had learned to move forward despite pity and scorn. What choice did she have? She stopped near the blacksmith shop, where the clanging of iron on steel rang sharp and steady. The colt stumbled again, nearly collapsing, and Clara dropped to her knees beside it, her hands fluttering uselessly at its trembling flank. "Don't you give up on me," she murmured, her voice raw with desperation. "You're all I've got left." For a long moment, she stayed there in the dust, a lone figure clinging to a half-dead creature, while townsfolk exchanged murmured comments behind her back. To them, she was just another drifter, another woman without roots who would likely vanish as quickly as she had come. But to Clara, this moment was a breaking point. If the colt died, she would lose not only the last connection to her father, but also the fragile thread of hope that had carried her across miles of unforgiving land. The sealed letter in her satchel pressed against her side like a stone. She had traced its edges countless times, her fingers memorizing every crease, but she still hadn't broken the wax. Her father's words, whatever they were, felt too heavy to face when she was so close to despair. She told herself she would open it when she was strong enough. Yet strength felt like a luxury she could no longer afford. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer ceased, and a silence spread over the street, broken only by the colt's labored breathing. Clara looked up, her eyes scanning the faces around her. Some turned away. A few held pity, others indifference. No one stepped forward. She was utterly alone. And yet, something stirred at the far end of the street. A figure on horseback, broad-shouldered and still, sat watching from the shadows beneath his hat brim. He did not speak, did not move closer, but his gaze lingered on Clara and the colt. Though she could not see his eyes clearly, a strange awareness prickled along her skin. She shifted uncomfortably, then turned her focus back to the animal, pushing the sensation aside. Whoever he was, she could not expect help. Not here. Not now. Clara pressed her forehead to the colt's damp neck, drawing a shaky breath. She thought of her father, of the nights he had spoken of Montana as a place of new beginnings. The land out there can be cruel, Clara, but it's honest. If you're strong enough, it'll give you back more than you put in. His words echoed in her mind, yet she felt only the sting of irony. Cruelty she could see everywhere around her, but the promise of something more? That remained beyond reach. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretching long across the dirt street. Clara rose slowly, tugging the colt upright again. Its legs buckled, but she steadied it, grit tightening her jaw. She could not falter, not when this fragile life depended on her. If the town offered no kindness, she would carve her own path, as she always had. Still, she could not shake the sensation of unseen eyes following her movements. The horseman remained at the edge of her vision, silent, unreadable, like a sentinel carved of stone. Clara swallowed hard, refusing to give in to fear or to hope. She was not ready to trust either. As the first stars pricked the twilight sky, Clara guided the colt toward the livery stable. The day had ended, but her battle was only beginning. Behind her, whispers rose once more, of the girl with the dying colt, the cursed wanderer who had come dragging sorrow behind her like a shadow. Ahead of her, uncertainty loomed vast as the Montana plains. And somewhere in between, just out of reach, was the quiet cowboy whose presence, though unspoken, already tethered her fate to his. The following morning broke crisp and pale, the Montana air sharp enough to sting Clara's lungs as she stepped outside the livery stable. Her colt had survived the night, though just barely. The animal's ribs stood out sharply beneath its hide, its breath shallow but steady. Clara had stayed awake beside it, brushing its mane with trembling hands, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. Exhaustion weighed heavy on her bones, yet relief flickered faintly. The colt had made it this far, perhaps, so could she. But reality pressed in quickly. She had no money, no shelter, and the townsfolk's sideways glances were clear enough. She was not welcome. The stable hand had allowed her to rest in a corner, but only out of pity, and Clara knew pity was a currency that ran dry fast. She squared her shoulders, determined not to let despair dictate her next step. She was tightening the colt's halter when a shadow fell across the stall. Clara froze, her hand hovering near the animal's neck, before slowly turning. There he stood, the rider she had glimpsed the day before. Up close, he was taller than she had imagined, his frame lean but undeniably strong beneath a weather-worn duster coat. A wide-brimmed hat shaded much of his face, but she could see enough. The angular line of his jaw, the sun-darkened skin, the faint scar cutting across his cheek. His eyes, a steady gray, regarded her with a calm intensity that made her pulse quicken against her will. He removed his hat slowly, a gesture both polite and deliberate. "Mornin'," he said, his voice low, measured, carrying the kind of weight that silenced a room without effort. Clara straightened, brushing dust from her skirt as though it might restore some dignity. "Good morning," she replied, her tone cautious. His gaze flicked to the colt, then back to her. "That horse won't last another week without proper care." The bluntness stung, though his words held no cruelty, only fact. Clara's chin lifted. "I know," she admitted softly, "but he's all I have." The cowboy studied her in silence, as though weighing not just her words, but her resolve. Then he said, "Name's Elijah Walker." Clara hesitated before answering. Clara May Benton. The name felt small when spoken aloud, as if stripped bare in his presence. Elijah's eyes lingered on her a moment longer, then drifted back to the colt. "He's got spirit, even sick as he is. Spirit counts for something. Same goes for folks." The comment caught her off guard. It wasn't pity, nor empty comfort. It was recognition, plain and steady, as if he could see the battle she fought to keep standing. Clara blinked back the sudden sting of tears, unwilling to let a stranger glimpse her weakness. "Why do you care?" she asked, her voice edged with defensiveness. Elijah didn't flinch. "Because I've seen too many good things die on this land when nobody gave a damn. Don't fancy watching it happen again." The words settled between them, heavy with something unspoken. Clara studied him closer, noting the weariness etched into his features. His scar wasn't just on the surface. It was mirrored in his eyes, in the way he carried himself, as though every step bore the weight of old wounds. Before she could respond, the stable hand shuffled in, muttering about space being wasted. Elijah's presence silenced him with a single look, and Clara realized something she hadn't before. This man commanded respect, even without raising his voice. "Bring the colt to my ranch," Elijah said finally, his tone quiet but firm. "Got room in the barn. Better feed, too." Clara blinked, stunned. Kindness was not something she had expected. Not from this town, not from a stranger. Her instinct screamed caution. Nothing came free, especially not here. "Why?" she asked again, more sharply this time. For the first time, Elijah's expression shifted. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Reckon even a quiet man's allowed to be neighborly." It wasn't an answer, not really, but something in his steady tone calmed the storm of doubt inside her. Clara glanced at the colt, then back at Elijah. Her options were painfully few. If she stayed, the colt would die. If she went with him, at least there was a chance. Finally, she nodded. "All right." Elijah inclined his head, as if acknowledging a silent agreement. "I'll bring the wagon. Be ready in an hour." He replaced his hat, gave the colt one last look, and turned to leave. Clara watched him go, her heart a tangle of relief, suspicion, and something she couldn't yet name. She pressed a hand against her satchel, feeling the outline of the unopened letter. Her father's voice echoed in her memory again. "The land out there can be cruel, Clara, but it's honest." Was Elijah Walker part of that honesty, or another trial meant to test her endurance? When Elijah returned with the wagon, Clara helped guide the colt aboard. The ride out of town was quiet, the only sounds the creak of wheels and the steady clop of hooves. Clara stole glances at Elijah, who kept his eyes on the horizon, his jaw set in a line of unyielding calm. He did not speak unless necessary, and his silence was not awkward but purposeful, like a man accustomed to listening more than talking. Yet there was a gentleness in the way he handled the reins, in the way he steadied the colt with a careful hand when it stumbled. It was a gentleness at odds with his rugged exterior, and Clara found herself watching him longer than she intended. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was high. Elijah helped her down from the wagon, his hand firm and steady as it clasped hers. The touch lasted only a moment, yet Clara felt it linger as though it had imprinted itself on her skin. The ranch sprawled wide, framed by wooden fences and rolling pastures. Horses grazed in the distance, their coats shining in the sunlight. It was a place that spoke of quiet strength, built not on grandeur but on resilience. Clara's chest tightened with an ache she hadn't expected. This land was alive, thriving. Perhaps here, she might find the beginnings of something more than survival. Elijah led the colt into the barn, motioning for Clara to follow. He spoke little, but every action, preparing fresh hay, filling a water trough, checking the animal's legs, showed competence and care. Watching him, Clara felt something shift inside her. Trust was dangerous, but in that moment, it felt less like a risk and more like a fragile thread pulling her toward hope. As the colt settled, Clara leaned against the barn post, exhaustion finally catching up with her. Elijah glanced at her, his gray eyes softening for the first time. "You did right by him," he said quietly. "Took grit to get him this far." Clara met his gaze, and for the first time since arriving in Ash Hollow, she didn't feel entirely alone. Life on Elijah Walker's ranch unfolded differently than Clara had imagined. It was not an easy refuge, nor was it meant to be. Work began at dawn, when the first streaks of light broke over the Montana plains, and ended only when the stars reclaimed the sky. Clara found herself mending fences, fetching water, and learning the rhythms of ranch life in ways her hands had never known. Every muscle in her body ached, but the ache felt honest, a reminder that she was alive and moving forward. The colt, now given proper care, began to show small signs of recovery. Its eyes grew clearer, its legs steadier, though its future remained uncertain. Clara checked on it constantly, whispering encouragement into its ears, as though the animal carried all her unspoken fears. In caring for the colt, she found purpose, but also pressure. If it died despite her efforts, what little hope she clung to might die with it. It was Elijah who unsettled her most. The man spoke sparingly, but his silences carried weight. He was steady, dependable, and careful in his actions, but there was a wall around him she could not breach. Sometimes she caught him staring at the horizon, lost in thoughts that seemed older than the mountains themselves. Other times, his eyes would flick to her, sharp and searching, as if trying to read the words she hadn't yet spoken. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, Clara finally opened her satchel. The letter her father had left her seemed to burn in her palm. She had put it off for too long, fearing its truth. With trembling hands, she broke the seal and unfolded the yellowing paper. "My dearest Clara," it began, "if you are reading this, it means I am gone. I have left you little but a colt and my blessing. The colt carries blood worth keeping alive. It is descended from the best line I ever bred. Guard it well, for it may open doors when all else fails. And Clara, remember this. Trust can heal what sorrow breaks. Don't let the world harden your heart. You are stronger than you know." Tears blurred her vision as she pressed the letter to her chest. Her father's words struck deep, both comforting and unbearable. She was stronger than she knew, but was she strong enough now? She did not notice Elijah step into the barn until his voice broke the silence. "You've been holding on to that a long while." Clara startled, quickly folding the letter. "It's private." Elijah nodded once, unoffended. "Fair enough." He lingered in the doorway, his hat in his hands. But sometimes what weighs on us loses its power when it's shared. The remark pricked her defenses. "And what of you, Elijah Walker? You speak of sharing, but you say so little of yourself. What ghost do you carry?" His jaw tightened. For a long moment, she thought he might walk away. Instead, he crossed the barn slowly, his boots crunching on the straw. "Lost my wife 5 years back. Illness took her quick. Left me with a house too quiet and land too big for one man." Clara's breath caught. The scar across his cheek, the silence in his eyes. It all made sense now. He was not just quiet. He was haunted. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her heart aching for him. Elijah's gaze softened, though his voice remained steady. "Grief makes folks into stone, Clara. I reckon I've been stoned for too long." His confession cracked something in her as well. For the first time, she felt the weight of his loneliness mirrored against her own. Their silences no longer felt like walls, but like bridges, fragile and forming. But peace was not to last. The very next week, trouble came to Ash Hollow in the form of a rancher named Thomas Grady. He was wealthy, ruthless, and hungry for land. When he heard of Clara's colt, a horse with valuable bloodlines, his interest turned sharp. Grady cornered her outside the mercantile, his words slick as oil. "Girl like you's in no place to keep a horse of worth," he said, his eyes narrowing. "Sell it to me before it dies under your care." Clara bristled, clutching the reins tighter. "He's not for sale." Grady smirked. "Everything's for sale, especially when folks are desperate." His gaze raked over her with condescension. "And you look desperate." Before Clara could retort, Elijah appeared at her side, his presence a quiet wall of strength. She said no. His voice was low, dangerous. Grady sneered. "Careful, Walker. You've got enough ghosts without adding hers." With a final glare, he mounted his horse and rode off, dust rising in his wake. Clara's hands trembled, but Elijah's steady grip on her shoulder anchored her. "Men like him feed on fear," he said. "Don't let him see yours." Yet fear lingered in Clara's chest. Grady's words echoed too closely to her own doubts. What if she truly wasn't strong enough to save the colt, or herself? That night, Clara sat awake by the colt's stall. Elijah joined her quietly, bringing a lantern that glowed warm against the darkness. They spoke little, but as hours passed, the silence grew companionable, almost tender. At one point, Clara leaned her head against his shoulder, exhausted. To her surprise, Elijah did not pull away. "You've changed this place," he murmured, almost to himself. "For years, it's been nothing but shadows. Now there's light again." Clara lifted her head, startled by his words. I'm no light, Elijah. I'm barely holding on. His eyes met hers, steady and unwavering. Holding on is more than most do. That makes you stronger than you think. The truth in his voice sank deep, breaking through the doubts that had chained her for so long. For the first time since leaving Kansas, Clara allowed herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, her father had been right. The Colt stirred, nuzzling her hand with a flicker of energy. Clara smiled through her tears, whispering, "We're both still fighting." Elijah's hand brushed hers in the lantern glow, a touch simple yet profound. In that moment, they were no longer two broken souls surviving side by side. They were beginning to heal, together. The day dawned heavy with storm clouds, the air tense as though the earth itself anticipated conflict. Clara had felt it building for days, a pressure that coiled tighter every time Thomas Grady rode past Elijah's ranch, his eyes sharp and calculating. She knew the man wouldn't rest until he got what he wanted, and what he wanted was the Colt. That morning, as Clara checked the Colt's stall, she noticed it was standing stronger than ever, its once weak legs now bearing it with surprising steadiness. The sight filled her with fragile hope. If the animal survived, it could be proof of her resilience, of her father's faith, and perhaps even of the new life she was learning to build. But hope had a way of inviting storms. By mid-afternoon, Grady arrived at the ranch with two hired hands. Dust trailed behind their horses like a battle flag, and the expressions on their faces left no doubt. They were here for the Colt, and they would not leave without it. Elijah was already waiting near the corral, his stance firm, his hand resting near his holster, though his weapon remained untouched. Clara felt her pulse quicken as she stepped to his side, the Colt's reins looped tightly in her hand. Grady's grin was slick and cruel. "Walker, I'm done asking polite. That horse belongs with a man who knows what to do with it. Hand it over before things turn unpleasant." Elijah's voice was calm, but the steel in it rang clear. "The Colt isn't yours, Grady. You'll leave now." Grady spat into the dust. "You've always been a fool, Walker. Lost your woman, lost your will, and now you're losing your land one fence at a time. Why tie yourself to a stray girl with nothing but bad luck trailing her?" His eyes shifted to Clara, sharp with mockery. "Everyone in town knows she's cursed. You're risking your ranch for a ghost." The words sliced through Clara like knives. For a heartbeat, shame threatened to pull her under. The old whispers from Kansas, the pitying looks, the doubt that she was worth saving, all of it surged back like a flood. But then Elijah stepped forward, his shadow shielding her. "She isn't cursed," he said, each word carrying the weight of unshaken conviction. "She's stronger than you'll ever be, Grady, and I believe in her." The world seemed to still. Clara's chest tightened, the words echoing her father's letter. "Trust can heal what sorrow breaks." For the first time, she felt her shame loosen, replaced by something fiercer, pride. Grady's smirk faltered, his temper flaring. "Fine," he snapped, motioning to his men. "Take the Colt." The hired hands dismounted, but before they could move further, Clara stepped forward, fire blazing in her eyes. "No," she said, her voice clear and steady. "This Colt isn't for sale, for trade, or for theft. It's mine, and I'll fight for it." The Colt shifted nervously at her side, as if sensing the tension, but Clara's grip on the reins did not waver. The standoff thickened until even the wind seemed to hold its breath. One of Grady's men glanced uneasily between his employer and Elijah, clearly hesitant. The other muttered something under his breath, uncomfortable with the idea of crossing a woman who stood so unyielding. Grady snarled in frustration, drawing his gun in a show of dominance. But before he could raise it, Elijah's hand moved with practiced swiftness, his revolver aimed steady at Grady's chest. His voice, though calm, carried the weight of thunder. "Put it away, Grady. This ends here." For a moment, Clara thought blood would stain the dust. But the sight of Elijah's unwavering stance, paired with Clara's fiery defiance, broke the spell. Grady hesitated too long, and in that hesitation, his power crumbled. With a bitter curse, he shoved his weapon back into its holster. "This isn't over," he spat. "You'll regret crossing me." He yanked his reins, spurring his horse hard, and his men followed reluctantly. Dust swallowed them as they rode away, leaving silence in their wake. Claire's knees threatened to buckle, but she stood tall, her chest heaving. The Colt nuzzled against her, as if in gratitude. Slowly, she turned to Elijah, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "You!" Her voice broke, then steadied. "You said you believe in me. Why?" Elijah holstered his gun, his gaze locking onto hers with quiet intensity. "Because I've seen you fight, Clara. Not just for that Colt, but for yourself. You've carried grief that would have broken most. Yet here you are, standing, healing, daring to hope. That takes courage. And maybe I've been waiting for someone to remind me how to hope again, too." His words cracked something open inside her, but this time it wasn't pain, it was release. The walls she had built around her heart, the shame she had carried like a second skin, all of it seemed to crumble under the weight of his simple truth. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but her smile was steady. "I don't feel cursed anymore," she whispered. Elijah reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You never were." The storm clouds overhead finally broke, rain falling in gentle sheets over the land. Instead of despair, it felt cleansing, washing away the dust, the fear, the years of sorrow. Clara tilted her face upward, laughing softly through her tears as droplets cooled her skin. The Colt whinnied, prancing with newfound strength in the rain. Clara's laughter deepened, joy bubbling out of her in a way she hadn't thought possible since childhood. Elijah's hand lingered in hers, warm and grounding. In that moment, under the storm's baptism, Clara felt reborn. She was no longer the girl burdened by loss and whispers of curses. She was a woman who had fought for what mattered, found strength in her father's faith, and discovered love not in fairy tale promises, but in the steady, unwavering belief of a quiet cowboy. And Elijah, once a man carved hollow by grief, felt the first stirrings of life in his heart again. The woman who had arrived with nothing but a dying Colt and a letter had given him more than he ever expected. Reason to hope, reason to heal, reason to love again. As the rain fell and the Colt danced, Clara and Elijah stood side by side, no longer broken souls, but two hearts bound by resilience, trust, and the revelation that sometimes belief itself is the greatest gift of all. The sky stretched wide over the valley, painted in strokes of gold and lavender as the day folded into evening. Sarah leaned against the fence rail, the softwood warm beneath her palms, and gazed out at the pasture where the Colt, once frail and barely clinging to life, now galloped with growing strength. Each stride the young horse took across the grass seemed to mirror the transformation in her own heart. Fragile beginnings nurtured into resilience, sorrow tempered into hope. Beside her stood Jacob, his tall frame steady and unhurried, his hat tipped low as though shielding his eyes from the setting sun. He didn't speak at first, and he didn't need to. His presence had become its own language, quiet reassurance, steadfast loyalty, and a promise that he would not walk away no matter how the world judged, no matter how heavy the burden seemed. The months had not erased Sarah's grief entirely. Grief, she realized, was not something to be erased. It was a thread woven into her being, a part of her story that had shaped the woman she had become. But standing here, watching life flourish where she once expected only loss, she knew grief had softened into something else, gratitude. Gratitude for the Colt who had forced her to keep going when she had wanted to stop. Gratitude for the letter from her late husband, which had once felt like a cruel reminder, but had become a bridge between past and future. And above all, gratitude for the quiet cowboy who had seen in her not just a widow, not just a woman broken by circumstances, but a soul worthy of love. Jacob finally shifted, the leather of his boots creaking against the dirt. "He's strong now," he said, nodding toward the Colt as it darted after its mother. His voice carried that familiar calm, the kind of strength that didn't need to roar to be heard. Sarah smiled faintly. "So am I." The words slipped out before she could stop them, and when she realized what she'd said, heat rose to her cheeks. But Jacob only looked at her, his eyes meeting hers, with a gentleness that made her feel seen in a way no one else ever had. It was in that moment that Sarah understood the real gift Jacob had given her. It wasn't just his help on the ranch, or his quiet company when the nights grew long. It wasn't even the tender way he had nursed the Colt back alongside her, or the patience with which he had listened when she finally shared the full story of her husband's passing. It was something far deeper. He had given her back her own reflection. He had reminded her that she was more than her loss, more than her loneliness. She was still capable of laughter, of hope, of love. And for Jacob, Sarah realized, there had been healing too. The silence he had carried, the shadows of battles fought and memories he never voiced aloud, they had softened in her presence. His world, once lived in muted colors, had gained vibrancy again. Just as she had found strength through him, he had found peace through her. As the sun dipped lower, a warm hush fell over the land. Sarah turned to Jacob, her voice quiet but firm. "You stayed, even when I pushed you away. Why?" Jacob's gaze lingered on the horizon for a moment before he answered. "Because I saw myself in you. Someone carrying more than they should. Someone who just needed someone else to believe they were strong enough to keep going." The simplicity of his words made Sarah's eyes sting with unshed tears. It wasn't a grand declaration, not the kind found in novels or whispered in the moonlight, but it was more than enough. It was real. The Colt neighed in the distance, circling back toward the fence. Sarah reached out, brushing her hand against its silky mane. When it drew close, the touch reminded her of that first day, when she had cradled the dying creature and felt despair claw at her heart. Now, with Jacob by her side and the Colt strong and alive, that memory no longer hurt. Instead, it became proof of how far she had come. She whispered softly, not just to the horse but to herself, "We survived." Jacob placed a hand gently over hers, his warmth seeping into her skin. "You did more than survive. You rebuilt." In the quiet that followed, Sarah realized that life was never about avoiding pain or outrunning loss. It was about finding the courage to keep tending the fragile things until they grew strong again, whether that fragile thing was a Colt, a heart, or a dream. The moral of her story became clear in that stillness. Love does not always arrive in the form we expect. Sometimes it comes not as a whirlwind but as a steady presence, a quiet hand reaching out when all you can do is hold on. Healing does not erase scars. It transforms them into maps of where we've been, guiding us toward where we're meant to go. Sarah leaned her head against Jacob's shoulder, allowing herself, at last, to rest. She didn't know what the future held in every detail, but she knew this. She was no longer alone, and neither was he. Together, they had turned brokenness into belonging, sorrow into strength, silence into a language of love. The sun slipped below the horizon, leaving behind a trail of fire and promise across the sky. And in that glow, Sarah felt her life opening again, not as it had been before, but as something new, something strong, something hers.